Chapter 13. Our story left William T. Sherman in camp at Atlanta during September 1864. Mentally and bodily in his prime of 44, he had added to an ample book knowledge of his profession 3 years of fruitful experience in the field. Whilst his warm friendship with Grant had proved of great advantage to each and to their country. Now his busy brain planned an extraordinary movement, a march to the sea. He proposed to leave Thomas to cope with Hood while, to use his own words, he should make Georgia howl. But the president felt much solicitude at his leaving Hood in his rear, believing that a misstep might be fatal to his army. Meanwhile Hood crossed the Tennessee River and invaded Tennessee. This movement made Grant doubt the wisdom of the plan, and he asked Sherman whether he had not better destroy Hood's army before starting southward. But Sherman, anticipating this objection, had already sent a dispatch to Grant allaying his misgivings and drawing from him the word, "Go as you propose." The march to the sea, the march northward from Savannah, and Thomas's operations in Tennessee are a combination of bold and effective strategy, possible only after the Chattanooga-Atlanta campaign and a fit sequel to it. 100 persons may have conceived the design of advancing to the ocean, but the genius of the general lay in foreseeing the possible moves of his adversary, in guarding against them, and in his estimate of the physical and moral results of cutting the Confederacy in twain. Wise in precaution and fully conscious of the difficulties of the venture, Sherman showed the same boldness and tenacity in sticking to his purpose when others shook their heads, as Grant had shown in his Vicksburg campaign. No general who lacked daring and resolution would have persisted in his determination to advance through Georgia after Hood had crossed the Tennessee River, especially when Grant himself for a while doubted the wisdom of the movement. Sherman was the commander, and, even as he knew his men and comprehended the conditions, he knew he could expect no success unless Thomas should defeat Hood. Therein, as the affair turned out, lay the risk. But Sherman knew Thomas through and through. Classmates at West Point, they had ever since been friends and had been drawn closer together by the vicissitudes of the Civil War despite differences of opinion arising from their diverse temperaments. Sherman had implicit confidence in Thomas, thought that he had furnished him a force sufficient for all emergencies, and that the defense of Tennessee was not left to chance. "If I had Schofield," Thomas telegraphed, "I should feel perfectly safe." 706 Sherman had already detached Schofield's corps from his army and sent it northward with instructions to report to Thomas for orders. On the day that Sherman started for the sea, Thomas sent this word, "I have no fear that Beauregard 707, Hood, can do us any harm now, and if he attempts to follow you, I will follow him as far as possible. If he does not follow you, I will then thoroughly organize my troops, and I believe I shall have men enough to ruin him unless he gets out of the way very rapidly." 708. At this time the Union commanders were uncertain whether Hood would follow Sherman or move north toward Nashville. The army that marched to the sea proved unnecessarily large, and 10,000 men more with Schofield would have saved some trial of soul, yet, as the problem appeared at the time, Sherman must be sufficiently strong to defeat Hood and the scattered forces of uncertain number which would gather to protect Georgia. Moreover, as his ultimate aim was to reinforce our armies in Virginia, he must have troops enough to oppose Lee until Grant should be at his heels. He reckoned that the force left in Tennessee was numerically greater than Hood's. 709 Considering everything that could have been known between November 1st and 12th, it seems clear beyond dispute that he made a fair division of his army between himself and Thomas. Sherman reviewed his decision with deliberation, care and foresight. Until within 6 days of his start southward, he held himself ready, if need were, to cooperate with Thomas in the pursuit of Hood, the one moving directly against the Confederates and the other endeavoring to cut off their retreat. For he admitted that the first object should be the destruction of that army. 710 But, as the days wore on, he came to believe that the advantages of the march to the sea outweighed those of any other plan, and he took the irrevocable step. Stopping at Cartersville on November 12 on his progress southward, he received Thomas's last dispatch 711 and replied, "All right." 712 A bridge was burned, severing the telegraph wire and all communication with Thomas and his government. As was the case with Julian, who plunged into the recesses of the Martian or Black Forest, so was Sherman's fate for many days, unknown to the world. 713 No direct intelligence from him reached the North from November 12 to December 14. I will not attempt to send carriers back, he had written to Grant, but trust to the Richmond papers to keep you well advised. 714 For these 32 days, Lincoln and Grant had no other information of this important movement than what they could glean from the Southern journals. Sherman's imagination was vividly impressed with the strangeness of the situation. Two hostile armies were marching in opposite directions, each in the full belief that it was achieving a final and conclusive result in the Great War. 715 It would be impossible to show an entire consistency in the utterances of this great general. A single aspect of the campaign often claimed his attention to the exclusion of all others, and he was so fertile in thought and fluent in expression that the idea uppermost in his brain was apt to burst forth without regard for what else remained behind. As with almost all men of action, the speculation of today might supersede that of yesterday only to disappear under that of tomorrow. Yet this did not impair his capacity for making a correct decision nor his steadfastness in the execution of a plan. Grant, more reticent and not at all expansive, is not chargeable in the same degree with inconsistency in his written words. He lacked imagination and did not worry. A remark of Sherman's provides an acute estimate of their different temperaments. Grant does not care for what the enemy does out of his sight, but it scares me. 716. While the army was concentrating at Atlanta, the railway station, machine shops and other buildings of that city which might be useful to the enemy in his military operations were destroyed. The right wing and one corps of the left wing having started the day before, Sherman rode out of Atlanta on November 16 with the 14th Corps. He had in all 62,000 able-bodied, experienced soldiers, well armed, well equipped and provided. As far as human foresight could, with all the essentials of life, strength and vigorous action. 717 One of the bands happening to play John Brown's Body Lies a Mouldering in the Grave, the men sang the well-known song, giving to the chorus, Glory, glory hallelujah, his soul is marching on, a force full of meaning. As their minds reverted to the events which had taken place since that December day in 1859 when he who was now a saint in their calendar had suffered death on the scaffold. When the march to the sea began, the weather was fine, the air bracing and the movement to the south and east exhilarated the men. Many of the common soldiers called out to their general, Uncle Billy, I guess Grant is waiting for us at Richmond. There was a devil-may-care feeling pervading officers and men, related Sherman, that made me feel the full load of responsibility. 718 The tale of the march is not one of battle and inch-by-inch progress as was the campaign from Chattanooga to Atlanta. As to the lion in our path, wrote Sherman after he had reached Savannah, we never met him. 719 Officers and men looked upon the march as a picnic, a vast holiday frolic. 720 The burden was on the general in command. He was in the enemy's country, he must show his skill by keeping this large army supplied. When the army set out it had approximately supplies of bread for 20 days, sugar, coffee and salt for 40 and about 3 days forage and grain. It had also a sufficient quantity of ammunition. All this was carried in 2,500 wagons with a team of 6 mules to each. Droves of cattle, enough to ensure fresh meat for more than a month, were part of the commissariat. The ambulances were 600 in number, the artillery had been reduced to 65 guns. Pontoon trains were carried along, as the invading host had many rivers to cross. The right wing was composed of the 15th and 17th Corps, the left, of the 14th and 20th, each corps marched on a separate road. The division of the wagon trains gave each corps about 800 wagons, which occupied on the march 5 miles or more of road. The artillery and wagons with their advance and rear guards had the right of way, the men taking improvised paths at their side. The troops began their daily march at dawn and pitched their camp soon after noon, having covered ordinarily 10 to 15 miles. Milledgeville, the capital of the state, was reached by the left wing in 7 days. This march through the heart of Georgia so alarmed the Confederates lest either Macon or Augusta or both might be attacked that they divided their forces. And, when it finally became clear that Savannah was the point aimed at, they found it impossible for various reasons to concentrate a large number of troops for defense. By December 10, the enemy was driven within his lines at Savannah, the march of 300 miles was over and the siege began. The Special Field Order of November 9 said, "The army will forage liberally on the country during the march." 721 As the state was sparsely settled and the plan of making requisitions on the civil authorities therefore impracticable, this was the only possible mode of supplying the troops. The arrangements for the foraging were made and carried out with military precision. Each brigade sent out a party of about 50 men on foot who would return mounted, driving cattle and mules and hauling wagons or family carriages loaded with fresh mutton, smoked bacon, turkeys, chickens, ducks, corn meal, jugs of molasses and sweet potatoes. As the crop was large, and had just been gathered and laid by for the winter, and as the region had never before been visited by a hostile army, the land was rich in provisions and forage. While Sherman and his officers sincerely endeavored to have the foraging done in an orderly way, the men were often riotous in seizing food on their own account. "A soldier passed me," so related the general, "with a ham on his musket, a jug of sorghum, molasses, under his arm and a big piece of honey in his hand, from which he was eating and, catching my eye he remarked in a low voice to a comrade, 'Forage liberally on the country.'" Sherman reproved the man as he did others when similar acts of lawlessness fell under his observation, explaining that foraging must be limited to the regular parties properly detailed. 722 Full of pride in his soldiers and elated at their manifestations of confidence in him, he had for them after the completion of the march only this mild censure, "A little loose in foraging they did some things they ought not to have done." 723 A spirit of fun pervaded the army which exhibited itself in innocent frolics. Typical of which was the meeting of some officers in the Hall of Representatives at Milledgeville where they constituted themselves the legislature of the state of Georgia. Elected a speaker and after a formal debate repealed by a fair vote the ordinance of secession. Destruction was a part of the business of the march, especially as Lee's army drew its supplies of provisions largely from Georgia. "The state of Georgia alone," said Jefferson Davis in a speech at Augusta, "produces food enough not only for her own people and the army within it but feeds too the army of Virginia." It became of the utmost importance to sever the railroad communication between the Gulf states and Richmond, and to this Sherman gave his personal attention. The bridges and trestles were burned, the masonry of the culverts blown up. In the destruction of the iron rails mechanical skill vied with native ingenuity in doing the most effective work. The chief engineer designed a machine for twisting the rails after heating them in the fires made by burning the ties. This was used by Michigan and Missouri engineers. But the infantry with the mania for destruction which pervaded the army joined in the work. Carrying the rails when they came to a red heat to the nearest trees and twisting them about the trunks or warping them in some fantastic way so that they were useless except as old iron and, even as such, in unmanageable shape for working in a mill. About 265 miles of railroad were thus destroyed. This in the heart of Jeff Davis's empire, as Sherman called it, effected a damage almost irreparable owing to the scarcity of factories which could make rails for renewals and to the embargo on imports by the blockade of the southern ports. Stations and machine shops along the lines were burned. Many thousand bales of cotton and a large number of cotton gins and presses were destroyed. At Milledgeville, Sherman reported, "I burned the railroad buildings and the arsenals. The State House and Governor's Mansion I left unharmed." 724 The penitentiary had been burned by the convicts before the arrival of the army. A Negro, from whom Sherman asked information regarding the operations of the right wing, thus described what he had seen: "First there come along some cavalrymen and they burned the depot. Then come along some infantry men and they tore up the track and burned it, and just before I left they sought fire to the well." 725 In the main, the general forbore destroying private property but, in nearly all his dispatches after he had reached the sea, he gloated over the destruction along the line of his march. Writing from Savannah, we have consumed the corn and fodder in the region of country 30 miles on either side of a line from Atlanta to Savannah, as also the sweet potatoes, cattle, hogs, sheep and poultry, and have carried away more than 10,000 horses and mules, as well as a countless number of their slaves. I estimate the damage done to the state of Georgia and its military resources at $100 million, at least $20 million of which has inured to our advantage, and the remainder is simple waste and destruction. This may seem a hard species of warfare, but it brings the sad realities of war home to those who have been directly or indirectly instrumental in involving us in its attendant calamities. 726 Well might he say afterwards, war is hell. Various orders given from time to time show that there was not only lawless foraging but that there was an unwarranted burning of buildings. A more serious charge against these men of the Western Army is pillage. Sherman admitted the truth of it, as did likewise General Cox. After the campaign, Sherman heard of jewelry being taken from women and was of the opinion that these depredations were committed by parties of foragers usually called bummers. Cox dubbed with that name the habitual stragglers, to whom he ascribed a large part of the irregular acts. Some of the pilfering was undoubtedly due to the uncontrollable American desire for mementos of places connected with great events. Moreover, while 3½ years of civil war had built up an effective fighting machine, they had caused a relaxation in the rules of orderly conduct among its members, so that it had come to be considered proper to despoil anyone living in the enemy's country. But the commander and his officers sincerely desired to restrain the soldiers within the limits of civilized usage. The lofty personal character of most of the men in high command and the severity of the punishment threatened for breaches of discipline are evidence of this. Nor should it be overlooked that much of the plundering charged to Sherman's men was actually done by Confederate bands. For my general characterization of the Union officers, one notable exception must be made. Kilpatrick, the commander of the cavalry, was notorious for his immorality and rapacity, and his escapades, winked at by Sherman on account of his military efficiency, were demoralizing to the army at the time, and have since tended to give it a bad name. With no purpose of extenuation, it is pleasant to record some of Sherman's words, which should be read in the light of his honesty of soul and truthfulness of statement. "I never heard," he wrote, "of any cases of murder or rape." 727. Sherman's campaign struck slavery a staggering blow. Everywhere the Negroes received the Northern soldiers with joy. Near Covington, an old gray-haired Negro said to Sherman that he had been looking for the angel of the Lord ever since he was knee-high, and he supposed that the success of the Northern army would bring him freedom. Another, who was spokesman for a large number of fellow slaves, said to an aide-de-camp of the general's, "I hope the Lord will prosper you Yankees and Mr. Sherman, because I tinks and we all tinks dat U.S.E. down here in our interests." At Milledgeville the Negroes in their ecstasy shouted, "Bless the Lord. Tanks be to Almighty God, the Yanks is come. De day ob Jubilee hab Arabed." 728 Negro men, women and children joined the column at every mile of our march, reported the commander of the left wing. The desire to realize their freedom at once was keen, and the number would have been far greater had not Sherman discouraged the Negroes from following the army, as all but the young and able-bodied, who were put to use, were a serious drawback. Increasing the number of mouths to be fed and causing constant apprehension lest they should hamper the movement of the troops in the event that the enemy were encountered in formidable array. But the tidings that President Lincoln had proclaimed them all free was spread far and wide. The moral effect of the march to the sea was very great. "Sherman's campaign has produced bad effect on our people," wrote Jefferson Davis. 729 At first it was popularly supposed at the South that the operation was hazardous and that the Union army might be checked or even destroyed. The Union force was underrated. The Confederate means of defense were estimated too high, especially as they were so disposed as to be ineffective. The marching columns met with little resistance. The victorious progress of this modern Attila, as Sherman was called, brought out indications that many people in the South were tired of the war. During the 32 days when the world lost sight of Sherman, the only news of him was from the Richmond newspapers, which came through Grant's lines, and from other Southern journals. copious extracts from which were printed in the northern dailies. The president was apprehensive for his safety, and, if Grant's recollection be correct, there was for a time considerable anxiety among people at the North who had husbands, sons or brothers in the invading army. The first word of his security was received in Washington on the evening of December 14. 4 days later came a dispatch from Sherman himself, saying that he had opened communication with the fleet. On the night of December 20 the Confederates evacuated Savannah. Sherman took possession of the city and sent his celebrated dispatch to President Lincoln, who received it opportunely on the evening of Christmas Day. "I beg to present you," the general said, "as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition and also about 25,000 bales of cotton." 730. When the balance of probabilities seemed to indicate that Hood would invade Tennessee, Sherman, on parting with General J.D. Cox, whom he was sending northward, said, "If there's to be any hard fighting you will have it to do." 731 This turned out to be the case. Tempted by the division of the Union Army and aiming to distract Sherman's advance into Georgia, 732 Hood on November 21 took the offensive and began his movement upon Nashville. His energy and alertness secured for him the advantage of superior numbers over General John M. Schofield, who endeavored to retard the Confederate advance so that Thomas might gain time for a concentration of the Union troops. Aware of his inferiority, Schofield executed a masterly retreat and, through strenuous exertions of officers and men, arrived safely at Franklin, where the impetuous Hood forced him to fight with a river at his back. Hood made a desperate frontal attack and was repulsed with terrible slaughter. General J.D. Cox shared with Schofield the credit for the brilliant victory. 733 The Union troops, under orders from Thomas, marched to Nashville. Hood followed Schofield to Nashville and sat down before the city with an army now reduced to 26,000, inviting his doom. 734 The reason he gave for continuing his advance northward was stated in his report of December 11, to force the enemy to take the initiative. 735 Thomas had now at Nashville 49,000 men. Thomas understood the position of affairs and knew that he should attack Hood. Feeling pretty sure that Hood would not attempt an advance to the Ohio River, or retreat southward, he was making his preparations complete with the aim of striking the Confederates a crushing blow. Meanwhile Grant was growing impatient, the more so as personally he did not like Thomas. The two were unsympathetic and their view of military movements was diverse. Grant loved Sherman and Sheridan and was always ready to overlook their shortcomings, but his attitude toward Thomas during these December days was that of an unrelenting fault-finder. Knowing that Hood's defeat was necessary for the success of Sherman's campaign, he could not control his annoyance at the delay. "Attack Hood at once," was his order of December 6. As no attack was made, he purposed relieving Thomas and placing Schofield in command, but suspending, for a space, the issuance of an order to this effect, he telegraphed to Thomas on December 11, "Let there be no further delay." Meanwhile a storm of sleet had converted the hills about Nashville into slopes of slippery ice, rendering any movement impossible until there should be a thaw. This was reported to Grant, who appeared to see in the intelligence only a further excuse for delay. In his unreasonable mood, he ordered General Logan to proceed to Nashville for the purpose of superseding Thomas in command of the Army of the Cumberland. 736 Then, growing still more anxious, he decided to go thither himself and had reached Washington on the way when he received word that Thomas had made the attack. Grant had been unjust to Thomas, looking at only one side of his character. While Thomas was deliberate unto slowness, he had the situation well in hand after the Battle of Franklin and was admirably fitted to cope with an impetuous general like Hood. This Sherman had divined when placing upon him such a weight of responsibility. Moreover, he had the confidence and devotion of his soldiers. In whatever way the circumstances may be regarded, there was no justification for superseding him by Schofield or Logan, and the sequel showed that he was abundantly equal to the demands made upon him. On December 15 Thomas attacked Hood and in the course of that day and the next struck him a crushing blow. When in the spring of 1864, Grant took command of all the armies of the United States, the two salient features of his plan were the destruction or capture of Lee's army and the crushing of the Confederate force in the Southwest. Before the close of the year, one half of the work had been accomplished. Hood's army was disintegrated. Not all, to be sure, of that compact and well-disciplined force of 53,000 with which Johnston had begun to resist Sherman's advance in May had been killed, wounded or made prisoners, but through casualties, desertions and forced furloughs. Practically none of it was left as a fighting body. As an army it is no longer known in the annals of the war, although 2 detachments of it appear to recall to us its wrecked fortunes. 9,000 of these discouraged and partially equipped soldiers turned up under Johnston in North Carolina, and 1692 went to Mobile. Jefferson Davis had unwittingly helped to bring about the destruction of the Confederate force in the Southwest by removing Joseph E. Johnston and placing Hood in command. Sherman began the ruin of Hood's army about Atlanta, Schofield gave it a severe blow at Franklin, Thomas completed the work at Nashville. There was good generalship. There were brave, devoted and energetic officers and men. Of course Sherman's successful march to the sea would have been a bitter disappointment to the North without Thomas's victory at Nashville. But the two together formed an important part of the grand scheme which broke down the military resistance of the South. The great achievement, the capture of Lee's army, still remained. While the people were rejoicing in the merriest season of the year over the success of Sherman and of Thomas, the President, Grant and Sherman were evolving the plan which should end the Civil War. 737. The President earnestly desired the adoption of a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery in the United States forever. Such an amendment had passed the Senate at the previous session, but it had failed to secure the requisite 2/3 vote in the House. It was still the same House of Representatives, but the President pointed out that the voice of the people as manifested in the national election was for the amendment, and that the House, which should come into being on March 4, 1865, would certainly pass it. Therefore, as it is certain to go to the states for their action, may we not agree that the sooner the better? He recommended the reconsideration and passage of the amendment. 738 on January 31, 1865, his ardent wish was gratified. When the Speaker announced that the constitutional majority of 2/3 had voted in the affirmative, there was great enthusiasm. In honor of the immortal and sublime event, the House adjourned. 739 This amendment, which is now known as the 13th, was in due time ratified by 3/4 of the states. To contrast the amendment, which Congress intended in March, 1861, to have numbered 13, with the existing addition to our Organic Act is to comprehend the mighty revolution of 4 years. That of 1861 reads, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state." That of 1865, which is a part of our Constitution, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." The South was approaching exhaustion. Sherman's march through Georgia and Hood's defeat at Nashville had bred a feeling of despondency far and wide. Lee called attention to the alarming frequency of desertions from his army, which were due mainly to the insufficiency of food and non-payment of the troops. 740 Even the Confederate paper money was not to be had, although this was fast losing value. $60 of it were needed to buy $1 in gold. Beef sold for $6 a pound and flour for $1,000 a barrel. The weather was cold and fuel scarce. Jones makes a record of the mercury at 0 and wood selling at $5 a stick. 741 In the midst of this distress came the news that Fort Fisher had fallen. 742 This closed Wilmington, North Carolina, the last open port of the Confederacy. Blockade running was now at an end. The trade with Europe of cotton and tobacco for needed supplies, on which the South had lived and carried on the war, must now cease. As the existence of the Confederacy depended on Lee's army, the most serious feature of a very grave situation was the lack of food for his soldiers. Sherman's march had cut off the supplies from Georgia, but meat and corn could be obtained from Southwest Virginia and the Carolinas. The permanent way, however, of the Richmond and Danville Railroad, on which the transportation of this food depended, had not been kept up. The locomotives, cars and machinery generally were out of repair so that the daily wants of the commissariat could hardly be met. Lee reported that the whole country within reach of his army had been swept clear. The Commissary General wrote that for several months the Army of Northern Virginia had been living literally from hand to mouth. 743 The overpowering difficulty was the lack of money. In North Carolina producers refused to sell, as they feared the government would not pay. In a number of Virginia counties along the Potomac the people, who had formerly held that patriotism required them to take Confederate money and refuse greenbacks, would now sell their cattle and hogs only for United States currency, cotton or gold. In Virginia generally gold or greenbacks were necessary to obtain horses. The value of the paper currency of a nation is a symptom of the nation's stability, and men had it thus brought home to them in the common operations of life. That the financial system of the Confederacy had broken down while the enemy's money was eagerly sought for within its borders. A natural step in reasoning led to a distrust of the whole Southern enterprise. Traffic across the lines with country under control of the Union forces was an important source of supply for Lee's army. This traffic, which consisted in the exchange of cotton for subsistence stores, was carried on largely by agents of the Confederate government. Despondency and discontent filled the public mind. President Davis was discontented with his Congress and Congress was equally discontented with him, and many people were dissatisfied with both. The General Assembly of Virginia by a unanimous vote expressed the opinion that Lee's appointment to the command of all the armies would promote their efficiency and reanimate the spirit of both soldiers and people. This was communicated deferentially and in confidence to Davis who, with ready sympathy, replied that he fully agreed with the Assembly. Shortly afterwards he appointed Lee General-in-Chief. 744 It is significant that all men, no matter how they might differ in other respects, turned with one accord to Lee as their savior if indeed salvation were to be had. His personal influence is illustrated by a circumstance occurring at this time. Heavy rains had destroyed a part of the Richmond and Danville Railroad, which was the main source of supply for his army, so that food could not be transported over it for a number of days. On a suggestion from the War Department, Lee made a personal appeal to the farmers, millers and other citizens to give him food, and although it was probable that nothing could have been impressed in that section, these men willingly brought in supplies sufficient to tide the army over its difficulty. Far below Lee in the public estimation came Jefferson Davis, yet next to Lee he was the strongest individual influence in this time of distress. The power which he exercised by virtue of his office, together with the fact that his opponents lacked a leader, make it difficult to discern what was public opinion. All yearned for peace and everybody would have been willing to give the North liberal conditions if she would grant independence to the Confederacy. This view was shared by Davis who, however, did not fully comprehend the widespread demoralization of the South. 745 His hopefulness gave him strength to rise above illness and a constant debility. He was inflexible and lacked tact in an eminent degree. Criticism was rife and various plans were proposed but, with rare exceptions, men failed to grasp the actual situation, that by superior resources and more efficient management the North had beaten the South. But it is impossible to tell how many saw the inevitable, that there could be no peace except by reunion and the abolition of slavery, and were willing to submit to these conditions. Thus matters were allowed to drift. The only feasible plan from a military point of view was to confer freedom on all slaves who would take up arms for the Confederacy. During the year 1864 the enlistment of slaves began to be mooted. And, on January 11, 1865, this policy received the sanction of General Lee, who proposed immediate freedom to all who should enlist and at the same time recommended a well-digested plan of gradual and general emancipation. 746 Congress did not act promptly on Lee's recommendation and, if there was any virtue in such a policy, it was now too late to avail anything. The enlistment of the slaves was strongly opposed and Howell Cobb, who at the commencement of the war owned 1,000 Negroes, argued against it with force. The day you make soldiers of them, the Negroes, he wrote, is the beginning of the end of the revolution. If slaves will make good soldiers our whole theory of slavery is wrong. 747 In truth it might have been asked, if we are voluntarily going to free our slaves, wherefore did we secede and go to war? But in January, 1865, nearly all Southerners, if asked, what are you fighting for? Would have answered, for our independence and against subjugation. Through the officious interference of Francis P. Blair, Sr. A conference was brought about between Lincoln and Seward on the one side and Vice President Stevens, Judge Campbell and Senator Hunter on the other. Known as the Hampton Roads Conference, it took place on board a United States steamer anchored near Fort Monroe, February 3. When personal courtesies had been passed and Whig memories revived between Lincoln and Stevens, Stevens asked, Mr. President, is there no way of putting an end to the present trouble? Lincoln replied in substance that, there is but one way I know of, and that is for those who are resisting the laws of the Union to cease that resistance. The restoration of the Union is a sine qua non with me. Judge Campbell inquired how restoration was to take place supposing that the Confederate States consented to it. Lincoln replied, by disbanding their armies and permitting the national authorities to resume their functions. Slavery was discussed. The President said that he never would change or modify the terms of the proclamation in the slightest particular, and Seward told the Southerners that the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery had just been passed by Congress. If the Confederate States were to abandon the war, asked Stevens, would they be admitted to representation in Congress? Lincoln replied that he thought that they ought to be, but he could not enter into any stipulation upon the subject. When Stevens pressed the point that there should be some understanding, Lincoln said that he could not treat with parties in arms against the government. Hunter said that this had been often done, especially by Charles I when at civil war with the British Parliament. Lincoln replied, I do not profess to be posted in history. On all such matters I will turn you over to Seward. All I distinctly recollect about the case of Charles I is that he lost his head in the end. After further discussion Lincoln burst out, Stevens, if I resided in Georgia with my present sentiments. I'll tell you what I would do if I were in your place. I would go home and get the governor of the state to call the legislature together and get them to recall all the state troops from the war. Elect senators and members to Congress and ratify this constitutional amendment, the 13th, prospectively, so as to take effect, say in 5 years. Whatever may have been the views of your people before the war, they must be convinced now that slavery is doomed. It cannot last long in any event, and the best course it seems to me, for your public men to pursue, would be to adopt such a policy as will avoid, as far as possible, the evils of immediate emancipation. This would be my course if I were in your place. Hunter summed up the talk, saying that nothing had been offered them but unconditional submission to the mercy of the conquerors. This Seward disclaimed in courteous terms, and Lincoln said that as far as the confiscation acts and other penal acts were concerned, their enforcement was left entirely with him, and on that point he was perfectly willing to be full and explicit, and on his assurance perfect reliance might be placed. He should exercise the power of the executive with the utmost liberality. He went on to say that he would be willing to be taxed to remunerate the Southern people for their slaves. He believed the people of the North were as responsible for slavery as people of the South, and if the war should then cease, with the voluntary abolition of slavery by the states, he should be in favor, individually, of the government paying a fair indemnity for the loss to their owners. He said he believed this feeling had an extensive existence at the North. He knew some who were in favor of an appropriation as high as $400 million for this purpose. But on this subject he said he could give no assurance, enter into no stipulation. He barely expressed his own feelings and views and what he believed to be the views of others on the subject. In the President's report to the House of Representatives he said, the conference ended without result, 748. 2 men, Lee and Davis, acting together, could have led the Confederate Congress and the South. Lee's caution, his deference to his superior and his aversion to assuming a responsibility that was not clearly his, probably prevented him from urging his president to negotiate a peace. But, if the memories of private conversation may be believed, he had lost all hope of success. It was Jefferson Davis who in this matter imposed his will on all his subordinates, and it was he more than anybody else who stood in the way of an attempt to secure favorable terms for the South in a reconstruction of the Union. If Davis, Lee, and the Confederate Congress could have made up their minds to sue for peace, the contemporaneous occurrences in Washington reveal the magnanimous spirit in which they would have been met by Abraham Lincoln. 2 days after the Hampton Roads Conference, on Sunday evening, February 5, the President called his cabinet together to consult them in regard to a message he proposed to send recommending that Congress empower him to pay to the 11 slave states of the Southern Confederacy then in arms against the Union and to the 5 Union slave states $400 million as compensation for their slaves provided that all resistance to the national authority should cease on April 1 next. The cabinet unanimously disapproved this project, and Lincoln with a deep sigh said, "You are all opposed to me and I will not send the message." Such a proposal to the Southern Confederacy, tottering to her fall, only 63 days before Lee's surrender to Grant, would have shown magnanimous foresight. Had the Confederate States accepted it, there would have been an immediate fraternal union after the Civil War. Had they rejected it, the President and Congress would have made a noble record. The offer, however, was too wise and too generous to be widely approved of men. Lincoln of all those in authority had reached a moral height where he must dwell alone and impotent. But when reflecting on the events from 1865 to 1877, men may well wish that the offer had been made. A month later, in the spirit of this Sunday, Lincoln uttered the sublime words of his second inaugural address, the greatest of presidential inaugurals, one of the noblest of state papers. 749. Chapter 14. Sherman with an army of 60,000, which was substantially the same as that which he had led from Atlanta to Savannah, started northward from Savannah on February 1, in the execution of a plan devised by himself. And on March 23 reached Goldsboro, North Carolina, having covered the 425 miles in 50 days. His progress to the sea had been a frolic, the march northward a long wrestle with the elements. At the outset the 1st Division encountered a deluging rain, causing a rise in the Savannah River which burst its dikes, washed over the road and nearly drowned many of the troops. Waiting until this flood abated and passing successfully the difficulties occasioned by the high water in the neighborhood of Savannah, the army plunged into the swamps of the Combahee and Edisto, and floundered through the flat quagmires of the river countries of the Petite and Cape Fear. They crossed 5 large navigable rivers, which the almost continuous rains of the winter had converted into lakes, at times marching through icy water waist deep. One day, as Sherman related the incident, while my men were wading a river which was surrounded for miles by swamps on each side, after they had been in the water for about an hour without much prospect of reaching the other side, one of them cried out to his chum, "Say, Tommy, I'm blowed if I don't believe we've struck this river lengthways." 750 where the country was not actually under water, there was deep mud, the incessant downpour made roads which were always difficult almost impassable, turned swampy ways into deep quagmires. It was chaos come again, wrote Cox, but the chaos was bridged for hundreds of miles 751 by this indomitable army. The roads were corduroyed, the streams and rivers were crossed on pontoon and trestle bridges. It would have been a difficult region for an army to march through had the inhabitants been friendly and no enemy near. But, under the direction of Wheeler's cavalry, details of Negro laborers had felled trees, burned bridges, and made obstructions to impede Sherman's progress. 752 To gain possession of the long causeways through the swamps it was necessary to outflank the enemy and drive him off. For this and other reasons there were skirmishes nearly every day, yet the army marched at the average daily rate of 10 miles. Sherman seems to have everything his own way, wrote Lee from Petersburg. 753 I made up my mind, said Joseph E. Johnston, that there had been no such army since the days of Julius Caesar. 754. The 2,500 wagons of the army carried a full supply of ammunition and a large number of government rations. The initial food supply was eked out and systematic foraging upon the country was carried on in the manner which had proved so successful in the campaign from Atlanta to the sea. The march began in South Carolina, continued directly through the center of the state and was marked by a line of buildings and cotton bales afire. The soldiers tore up the railroads, applied the torch to their woodwork, twisted the rails and destroyed all water tanks, engines and machinery. The Confederates set fire to cotton to prevent its falling into the hands of the Union Army, and what they spared was burned by the Northern soldiers in the territory which they were merely traversing and could not hope to occupy permanently. In the high circles of the Army a bitter feeling existed against South Carolina as the cause of all the trouble of the past 4 years. "The whole Army," Sherman wrote, "is burning with an insatiable desire to wreak vengeance upon South Carolina. I almost tremble at her fate but feel that she deserves all that seems in store for her." 755 With such sentiments at headquarters, it is little wonder that the rank and file thought it legitimate to despoil the enemy and set fire to his houses. Still, most of these irregular acts were committed by stragglers. Sherman's orders may probably be justified from the military point of view, but they left loopholes for the mania for destruction. And the necessities of the case and the burden of responsibility resting upon him may have caused him to wink at the havoc wrought by his army. The evidence shows, however, that many of the general officers did their best to stop the depredations of their soldiers, and some punishments were inflicted. From this statement must again be accepted Kilpatrick, whose command suffered no restraint and were forward in destruction and pillage. The most notorious occurrence during this march was the partial destruction by fire of Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, but this was due neither to Sherman nor Wade Hampton nor any other Federal or Confederate officer. 756. The occupation of Columbia by Sherman compelled the abandonment of Charleston on February 18 by the Confederates. Efforts were made to collect a force which should be able to resist the Union Army, but, in view of the steadily advancing host, they seem to have been puny and at any rate were of no avail. When Davis heard that the evacuation of Charleston was necessary, he wrote, "I had hoped for other and better results, and the disappointment is to me extremely bitter." 757. In Charleston much property was destroyed, but it was the Confederates who, through accident or design, were the agents of destruction. The Federal troops on entering the city found public buildings, stores, warehouses, railroad bridges, private dwellings and cotton afire, but they afterwards wreaked their vengeance on this cradle of secession by robbery and pillage. Probably the majority of Northern people at the time had no other idea of Charleston's distress than that it was abundantly deserved. But the suffering and want in this former abode of wealth and refinement must evoke in us now sympathy with the community on whom the horrors of war were visited. To understand the march through South Carolina, the hatred of officers and soldiers for the state which had taken the lead in the secession movement must be borne constantly in mind. This undoubtedly led many of them into transgressions which they had not committed in Georgia and from which they afterwards refrained in North Carolina, while it furnished the stragglers a ready excuse for their robberies and outrages. General Blair reported on March 7 that every house on his line of march today was pillaged, trunks broken open, jewelry, silver, etc., taken. 758 Cox had evidence after the war of robberies and even partial hanging to extort the disclosure of a place where money and valuables were hidden. Stragglers, deserters from either army, marauders, bummers, and strolling vagabonds, Negroes and whites committed outrages upon the inhabitants. 3 cases of rape and 1 of murder were reported. 759 In some cases punishment was inflicted. Howard directed that a soldier who had violently taken a watch from a citizen should have his head shaved and be drummed out of the service. Cox, who commanded the 23rd Corps in Schofield's army, 760 executed the death sentence pronounced by court-martial for a rape. The culprit, according to his recollection, was a bounty jumper. A military commission, having found a private soldier guilty of the murder of a North Carolina citizen, sentenced him to be shot to death with musketry. 2 days later the sentence was executed. 761 Sherman asserted generally that whenever individuals were detected in theft they were punished, but, in going over the evidence, one cannot fail to note many offenses and few penalties. Yet despite the general lawlessness, of which we obtain glimpses from time to time, outrages on the persons of women were rare. Sherman testified under oath that in the whole of the march he heard of but 2 cases of rape. The tendency of federal officers, apart from the contemporary documents, has been to minimize the depredations, and the tendency of many Northern writers has been to gloss them over. So that even if every instance brought to light by Northern testimony be mentioned, the Union armies will suffer no injustice by the seeming redundancy of facts. So much of the Southern evidence is not specific and all of it is so pervaded with intense feeling that I have preferred to develop this subject from Northern sources, leaving the natural inference to be drawn that, if all had been told, the evidence against Sherman's army would have been somewhat greater. 762 The men who followed Sherman were probably more humane generally than those in almost any European army that had marched and fought before our Civil War, but any invading host in the country of the enemy is a terrible scourge. Sherman reached Fayetteville, N.C., on March 11 and, by means of a steam tug, which had come up the Cape Fear River from Wilmington, was placed in communication with Schofield 763 and therefore with Grant and Stanton. Up to February 22 Grant, through the Richmond newspapers, had kept pretty well informed of Sherman's progress. But on that day the newspapers were requested by the authorities not to publish any news connected with the pending military movements in the Carolinas, so that afterwards he could cull from them only meager and unsatisfactory information. In his letter to Grant, Sherman said, "The army is in splendid health, condition and spirit although we have had foul weather and roads that would have stopped travel to almost any other body of men I ever read of." 764. On March 21 Schofield reached Goldsboro, N.C., where, 2 days later, Sherman's army made with him the desired junction. "Were I to express my measure of the relative importance of the march to the sea and of that from Savannah northward," wrote Sherman, "I would place the former at 1 and the latter at 10 or the maximum." 765 He might have continued in Napoleon's words written during his Austrian campaign, "I have destroyed the enemy merely by marches." 766. Sherman himself went to City Point to have a consultation with Grant and there met President Lincoln. The three had 2 interviews, one on the afternoon of March 27 and the other next day when they discussed the past operations, the harbinger of their success, and the approaching end of the war. Lincoln and Sherman did most of the talking while Grant listened and ruminated. According to Sherman's recollection of the interviews, the 2 generals were agreed in their opinion that one or the other of them would have to fight one more bloody battle and that it would be the last. Lincoln said more than once that enough of blood had been shed and asked if another battle could not be avoided, to which Sherman made answer that they could not control that event. It rested with Jefferson Davis and General Lee whether or not the 2 armies should meet again in a desperate and bloody battle. 767. In truth these masters of state and war, the 3 men to whom above all others we owe the successful termination of the conflict, could not without gladness review the military operations of the last year and look forward to the promise of the future. But they appreciated too well the magnitude of the business in hand to give way to undue elation. As in May, 1864, Grant was confronted by Lee and Sherman by Johnston. 768 But Grant had fought his way from the Rapidan to the James and the Appomattox, while Sherman, after a contested progress from Dalton to Atlanta, had made a holiday march to the sea followed by a march northward with the elements for his bitterest foes. He had achieved his purpose and was now at Goldsboro, N.C., with 80,000 men preparing to advance against Johnston, who lay between him and Raleigh with an army of about 33,000. In other parts of the theater of war, there were large and well-appointed Union forces bent on aggressive operations, working under Grant's efficient direction with the common purpose of dealing the enemy a final blow. But it was confidently believed that if Lee and Johnston could be forced to surrender, the rest of the military resistance would collapse. In this final encounter, the generals were well matched in intellectual ability but the material resources on the Union side were vastly greater. Yet the latent power of resistance in soldiers, skillfully and honestly led, who believe that they are fighting against the subjugation of their people, must be rated high, as so many instances in history attest. The more profound the study of the last days of the Confederacy, the firmer will be the conviction that the best of management was required of the North to assure the end of the war in the spring of 1865. In one respect fortune had signally favored the Union. Although distributing, in the last 2 years of the war, the favors of military skill with an equal hand, she had at the same time given to the United States a great ruler. Manifestly superior as had been Davis's advantages in family, breeding, training and experience, he fell far below Lincoln as a compeller of men. We have seen Lincoln in times of adversity and gloom and have marveled at his self-effacement, and we have seen him listening to words of advice, warning and even reproof such as are rarely spoken to men wielding immense power. And throughout he has preserved his native dignity and emerged from nearly every trial a stronger and more admirable man. Grant appears at his best in the final operations of his army. He is the Grant of Donelson, Vicksburg and Chattanooga with a judgment developed through larger experience and the discipline of adversity. The full reports and detailed dispatches admit us to the actual operations of his mind as he surveyed the vast field over which his armies, always in touch with him, moved to their several tasks in his grand scheme of strategy. He combined self-confidence with caution. He did not underestimate his enemy, he did not, as he perceived the successful operation of his plans, give way to elation, thinking the work already done which was only half done. But he was not too cautious to move forward boldly and without fear of the result. In Sherman and Sheridan he had helpers on whom he could rely as if each were another self. Seeing things alike, they were in complete sympathy with him. They comprehended his orders and carried them out in letter and spirit as did no other of his subordinates. Sherman's marching and fighting were now over, but Sheridan was to be to Grant a prop and a weapon such as Stonewall Jackson had been to Lee in his earlier campaigns. With the force immediately under him, Grant had, besides Sheridan, an efficient coadjutor in Meade, and good corps commanders in Warren, Humphreys, Ord, Wright and Parke. At the commencement of the Appomattox campaign, he had in this army 116,000 effectives while Lee mustered 52,769. Since the summer of 1864 Grant had besieged Richmond and Petersburg. The progress of the siege had been slow but persistent until, soon after the middle of February, Lee began to consider the eventuality of abandoning both cities. While in the freedom of private conversation he may have expressed himself in a despairing tone, his dispatches indicated a belief that there was still a chance of success in fighting on. Moreover, he made it clear that he would resist the foe as long as resistance was possible unless he were advised to yield by the superior civil authority. He infused an energy into his sortie of March 25, which, though the attempt was unsuccessful, demonstrated that there was still a great deal of fight in him and his army. The Union lines did not encircle Richmond and Petersburg, but left open an avenue of escape to the west and southwest. The Richmond and Danville Railroad and its Petersburg connection, the South Side or Lynchburg Railroad, which were the lines of supply for Richmond and Petersburg, were in operation. Grant spent days of anxiety lest Lee should abandon these places and, after getting away from him, either make a junction with Johnston or, retreating by way of Lynchburg, secure himself in the mountain fastnesses and make a raid into East Tennessee. Should the two Confederates unite their forces, he feared a long, tedious and expensive campaign consuming most of the summer. 770 Lee considered the two alternatives and preferred the union with Johnston. But, if Davis's memory may be trusted, Lee never contemplated surrender, but, in emulation of a plan of Washington's, purposed as a last resort retreating to the Virginia mountains where he thought that he might carry on the war for 20 years. 771 Taking all conditions into account, the game was equal and was played with skill on each side. On March 29, Grant began his movement on his own left and at night had an unbroken line from the Appomattox River to Dinwiddie Courthouse. From his headquarters in the field he wrote to Sheridan, "Now feel like ending the matter if it is possible to do so without going back." 2 nights and a day of heavy rain interrupted operations, but on the 31st the advance was resumed, when Lee attacked the 5th Corps and the Union cavalry and gained a temporary success. Sheridan, in falling back, wrote Grant, displayed great generalship. On April 1 Sheridan fought in a masterful way the Battle of Five Forks, which resulted in disaster to the Confederates. "He has carried everything before him," is Grant's account of this action. The General-in-Chief received the intelligence of the victory of Five Forks at 9 in the evening and immediately ordered an assault on the enemy's line, which was made at an early hour next day, his army won a decisive victory. 7:72 on the night of April 2, Lee evacuated Richmond and Petersburg, with the intention of concentrating his troops at Amelia Courthouse, and making his way to Danville, whence he would effect a junction with Johnston's army. After him, next morning, followed the Union forces in eager pursuit. As late as April 1, Davis apparently thought that there was no immediate necessity for the abandonment of Richmond. On the morning of Sunday the 2d he was at St. Paul's listening to the noble liturgy of the Episcopal Church. The clergyman was reading for the last time in his ministry the prayer for the President of the Confederate States. Here Davis was apprised by a messenger from the War Department of the gravity of the military situation. He left his pew quietly and walked out of the church with dignity to receive Lee's telegram, which gave an account of his disaster and advised that Richmond be abandoned. The news spread rapidly, and so unexpectedly had it come upon the city that the greatest confusion and excitement prevailed as functionaries and citizens made ready for flight. Davis, with all the members of his cabinet, except the Secretary of War, a number of his staff and other officials, got away at 11 o'clock in the evening on a train of the Richmond and Danville Railroad and reached Danville next afternoon in safety. Under Lee's previous order, Ewell, who was in command of the troops in Richmond, directed that the tobacco in the city should be burned and that all stores which could not be removed should be destroyed. It is probable that the fires lighted in pursuance of this order spread to shops and houses, and it is certain that in the early morning of April 3 a mob of both colors and both sexes set fire to buildings and began to plunder the city. Ewell said in his report that by daylight the riot was subdued, and Jones wrote that at 7 o'clock in the morning men went to the liquor shops in execution of an order of the city government and commanded that the spirits be poured into the streets. The gutters ran with liquor, from which pitchers and buckets were filled by black and white women and boys. By 7 o'clock also the evacuation of Richmond by the Confederates was completed. The Union troops passed cautiously the first line of the Confederate works, but as they met with no opposition, they went by the next lines at a double quick, and when the spires of the city came into view, they unfurled a national banner. And their bands striking up "Rally round the flag," they sent up cheer on cheer as they marched in triumph through the streets. But they found confusion, an extensive conflagration and a reign of pillage and disorder. Their commander, Weitzel, received the surrender of Richmond at the City Hall at 8:15, and, by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they had quelled the tumult and put out the fires, but not before a considerable portion of the city had been destroyed. The Union soldiers were received by the white people gratefully and by the Negroes with joy. Full of meaning was the visit of President Lincoln to Richmond, which was made from City Point next day in an unostentatious and careless manner. Proper arrangements had been made for his conveyance and escort, but, owing to two accidents, the President completed his river journey in a 12-oared barge and walked about 1.5 miles through the Richmond streets accompanied by Admiral Porter and 3 other officers with a guard of only 10 sailors armed with carbines. He was received with demonstrations of joy by the Negroes and, though the city was full of drunken civilians, he met with neither molestation nor indignity. He went to the house which Davis had occupied as a residence, now Weitzel's headquarters, and, if we may believe some personal recollections, looked about the house and sat in Davis's chair with boyish delight. Lincoln passed the night in Richmond and on April 5 returned to City Point. Under that date Jones reported perfect order in the city, and Dana telegraphed from Richmond, "Whig appeared yesterday as Union paper. Theater opens here tonight." 773. The Army of Northern Virginia evacuated Richmond and Petersburg during the night of April 2 and the early morning of the 3d. Grant, without tarrying for a visit to Richmond, set after them in hot pursuit. After a chase of 80 miles he hemmed them in and compelled their surrender. 774 When Lee became convinced that further resistance was useless he said, "Then there is nothing left me but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." He ordered the white flag to be displayed, requested by letter a suspension of hostilities and an interview with Grant. The two generals met at McLean's house in the little village of Appomattox Courthouse. Lee wore a new full-dress uniform of Confederate gray, buttoned to the throat, and a handsome sword, the hilt of which was studded with jewels, while Grant had on a blouse of dark blue flannel unbuttoned in front and carried no sword. 775, in my rough traveling suit, wrote Grant, the uniform of a private with the straps of lieutenant general, I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high and of faultless form. 776 Although jubilant over his victory, Grant, on coming into personal contact with Lee, felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly. 777 Grant was magnanimous, Lee heroic in his adversity. Generous terms were offered and the paper signed that ended the war. The number of men surrendered was 28,231. The Confederates had been living for the last few days principally upon parched corn and were badly in need of food. Grant supplied them with rations. As soon as the Union soldiers heard of the surrender, they commenced firing salutes at different points along the lines. He ordered these stopped, saying, "The war is over, the rebels are our countrymen again. And the best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field." 778. Lee rode back sorrowfully to his soldiers. With eyes full of tears he said, "We have fought through the war together. I have done the best I could for you. My heart is too full to say more." 779 On the morrow he issued a farewell address to the Army of Northern Virginia and rode away to Richmond. The army disbanded and dispersed to their homes. 780. The news of Lee's surrender was received in Washington at 9 o'clock on Sunday evening, April 9, and at a somewhat later hour in other cities. While the people had exulted at the occupation of Richmond, they perceived that the possession of the capital of the Confederacy did not imply the end of the war. But now it was in everybody's mouth, the great captain of the rebellion had surrendered. This imported that slavery was dead, the Union restored, and that the nation lived. So pregnant an event ought to be made known speedily to Europe. Accordingly the Inman Line dispatched a special steamer on the Monday to carry the intelligence across the ocean. The people of the North rejoiced on the night of the 9th and during the day and evening of the 10th as they had never rejoiced before, nor did they on any occasion during the remainder of the century show such an exuberance of gladness. Business was suspended and the courts adjourned. Cannons fired, bells rang, flags floated, houses and shops were gay with the red, white and blue. There were illuminations and bonfires. The streets of the cities and towns were filled with men who shook hands warmly, embraced each other, shouted, laughed and cheered and were indeed beside themselves in their great joy. There were pledges in generous wine and much common drinking in barrooms and liquor shops. There were fantastic processions, grotesque performances and some tomfoolery. Grave and old gentlemen forgot their age and dignity and played the pranks of schoolboys. But always above these foolish and bibulous excesses sounded the patriotic and religious note of the Jubilee. "Praise God from whom all blessings flow," were the words most frequently sung in the street, the Board of Trade and the Stock Exchange. One writer recorded that in the barroom of Willard's Hotel, Washington, when the news arrived, an elderly gentleman sprang upon the bar and led the crowd in singing with unwonted fervor the well-known doxology. 20,000 men in Wall Street sang it with uncovered heads. On the Tuesday, Trinity Church, New York, was crowded for a special service. The choir chanted the Te Deum and at the bidding of the clergyman the congregation rose and, inspired by the great organ and guided by the choir, sang the noble anthem, Gloria in Excelsis. These opening words, "Glory be to God on high and on earth peace, goodwill towards men," had a peculiar significance to the Northern people who during these days of rejoicing were for the most part full of generous feeling for the South. Patriotism expressed itself in the songs, "John Brown's Body," "My Country," "'Tis of Thee," "Rally Round the Flag," and the "Star-Spangled Banner." Lowell instinctively put into words what his countrymen had in their hearts, "The news, my dear Charles, is from heaven." I felt a strange and tender exaltation. I wanted to laugh and I wanted to cry and ended by holding my peace and feeling devoutly thankful. There is something magnificent in having a country to love. 781. The surrender of Johnston to Sherman naturally followed Lee's surrender. The war was over. Between these two events our country suffered the greatest disaster in its history. Lincoln was assassinated. Walt Whitman sang, "O Captain! My Captain! Our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. O Captain! My Captain! Rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills. My Captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still." Although exasperated by Lincoln's assassination, the North was at the same time inspired by the grandeur of Grant's conduct at Appomattox. Nobody was hanged for a political crime, 782 no land of the vanquished Confederates confiscated. "Since the Americans' most noble closing of the Civil War," wrote George Meredith, "I have looked to them as the hope of our civilization." 783. The great man of the Civil War was Lincoln. Lacking him the North would have abandoned the contest. His love of country and abnegation of self made him a worthy leader. Other rulers of great power have remorselessly crushed those who stood in their way. He said, "I am not in favor of crushing anybody out. Give every man a chance." Lincoln is not as Mommsen wrote of Caesar, the entire and perfect man who worked and created as never any mortal did before or after him. Verily Caesar created Caesarism for the modern world, the autocracy of the Superman. But which is the better policy to transmit to mankind, despotism or liberty? The better injunction, submit yourselves unto Caesar, or give every man a chance. In intellect Caesar and Lincoln are not to be compared. We speak of the mighty Caesar, never of the mighty Lincoln. But nobody speaks of honest Julius, while honest old Abe will live through the ages. The End.